everybody talks about the bear as being the strongest piece of Go Down Moses. I'm going to argue a different angle with this video series. Today we're going to be looking at Was, Chapter 1 of Go Down Moses, and what you may be missing from this piece coming up. Alright, welcome to the CodeX Cantina. I am Una, no crypto today, and we are looking at Was, Chapter 1, which can be considered kind of a short story of Go Down Moses. If you are starting here, please consider checking out our Before You Start Go Down Moses video. In that piece, we give you a little bit more of the background about what's happening in this era, some of the themes that Faulkner goes for in this work, as well as maybe some of Faulkner's writings if you're new to him, because I will say that this is one of the better places to start and be able to chunk and parse out what are some themes and elements that are important to William Faulkner and his writing. Now, one of the things that we covered there was his hatred of slavery and how slavery negatively influenced generations after it was even became illegal. The Jim Crow era is something that is not new to being covered, but I feel like he does do a different coverage here for at least most of these, except for maybe part 3. Now, with that said, chapter 1 is Was, and I think that title is very suggestive to say this is how it was before things to how they became for Faulkner's time, right? So this came out in 1941 in the heart of Jim Crow era, pre-civil rights movement. We are separate, but we are not equal. Now, in section 1 this is talking about the slavery era, when an entire race of people were still considered property instead of actual upright human beings. But Faulkner does it in a very interesting way here. So let's kind of dive into that. I think this is a good introduction. However, you will notice that the N-word is used a lot more in this section as opposed to all the other sections almost combined for this book. Why? Because at this point in time, this word is used to denigrate the people that are being used as property instead of viewing them as people. So you'll see that this is used more often here as a literary device to invoke that reaction, particularly in our era where this word is even worse than when it was back then. It was actually a lot more acceptable in Southern literature and life. So what we're going to do is a step-by-step guide here. We're going to go into heavy detail here. Check out the Before Go Down Moses if you just want the overall themes and everything, but we're going to really break this down as I think this is a very important text that is not getting enough discussion today. So let's see if we can bring that to people today who want to talk about this work. So the story starts out with a really interesting chicken coop chase. Well, we've got the narrative, right, that kind of sets up the story, and we'll come back to that. But let's start with this chicken coop chase, because you'll notice that there's this fox and there's this dog rousing everyone along with the chickens being chased. You kind of have like this triangle chase. What's that really doing? That's setting up almost this triangle chase that's about to happen with the humans as well. It really foreshadows how one of the main characters of this is Turrell, who's going to be referred to as Tomy's Turrell, Tomy being his mother. Again, another way to show that these people are viewed as property. Later on, we learn his name is Turrell, but I'm going to call him Turrell right now just from a short story, looking at it at just a Was perspective. And he's chasing Tenny, his love to be over at the Beauchamp Farm, who at the Beauchamp Farm, we have Sofonzaba, who's chasing Uncle Buck or Uncle Buddy, who's thus the chasing Turrell. So again, just like the chicken coop with the dogs and then the fox, we also have that triangle here with these people chasing each other here as well. So it starts out with them starting this chase. They're going to go to the Beauchamp Farm because Turrell, I think sometimes twice a year, I think they said, goes to here to see his honey, Tenny, and they got to go chase him down and bring him back. Slavery is legal at this point in time. Tenny is a slave. Turrell is a slave. They're going to get their property from their viewpoint back. And I'm going to give you a website down below that shows you some genealogy trees. And what I like about this website is if you cheat and you're looking at either the official Yoknapatawpha database, or if you're looking at one of those Cliff Notes versions, they'll give you the finalized view. Well, part of the beauty of this story is he's exploring lineage and how that impacts people's lives through this. So I'm going to give you a website that shows you just the genealogy tree in order as if you're reading Was, so that way you don't get spoilers for later on as you start to explore lineage throughout this piece. So Turrell is going to the Beauchamp Farm, and Uncle Buck and Buddy realize they got to go get him. Buck starts to put on his necktie, and we're going to come back to that, because why put on a necktie? He ain't putting it on for his brother, and he ain't putting it on for the guy's farm that he's going to. So it's kind of interesting that he picks a necktie at this point in time. Put a pin in that. And McCaslin Edmonds, who is 9 in this story, but don't forget he's going to be 16 years older than Ike, the guy from the first chapter. So you'll see, hey, here's a story about before you were born, and you'll notice when we're talking about memory, he kind of plays with, I think, some innocence here of a young boy witnessing this interesting chase. So they're chasing after Turrell. They see him. There's a little mini adventure, but let's jump ahead to the Beauchamp Farm. Here, Hubert, when he sees or starts talking about Turrell, refers to him as that damn half-white McCaslin. Now, Uncle Buck's a McCaslin. Uncle Buddy's a McCaslin. What's he talking about here with that half-white? Well, what we learn is that the man that they're chasing, Turrell, is their half-brother slave that they view almost as property, almost kind of not really a brother in this piece, okay? But let's not forget that part of that line that's really important, that we are chasing a brother that we're viewing and using as a slave. A small side note here is one of Faulkner's best friends growing up, Phil Stone, actually had an uncle, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, but Theophilus and Amadeus, who are nicknamed Buck and Buddy, who became inspirations for the characters in this piece. So once they're here, there's an interesting line, had a rotted floorboard, never got around to having fixed. I think this represents something wrong with Southern plantations, the idea that there's something rotten that they're not fixing, the idea of using slavery, which Faulkner hated very much. I think you see some subtle plays here that he is pointing, he has an opinion on this. He's not just painting this picture and putting it out there. So while they're there, it's kind of interesting. Hubert gets them to kind of start drinking a little bit and spending a little bit of time with Miss Sophonsiba. He wants to marry his sister off. Now, meanwhile, Turrell, the one that's supposed to be hiding, kind of out in plain sight, starts talking to McCaslin Edmonds and says that he's got a plan and he's got some aid to do it. Talking about if you want something done, you can use women to do it. You get the impression that he is working not only with Tenny, but he is probably working with Sophonsiba at this point in time. Why? Turrell wants to spend more time with his girl, Tenny, but they are at different farms. Sophonsiba's at one farm, Buck's at the other one. What would happen if we got these two married? We start to see how Turrell and Tenny and Sophonsiba, the slaves and the women, are actually pulling the strings in this picture. In a hero's journey, you're following Buck thinking you're chasing down the slave, and you're like, whoa, wait. You start to realize that we have a whole hidden story behind the picture here of who's really pulling the strings in this. I think there might also be a question here about Warwick. So why does Sophonsiba call this area Warwick and call her brother the Earl? Going back to also that floorboard kind of being something's wrong. She is aggrandizing her area, her plantation. And at the time, a lot of Southern literature did that as well in terms of the Southern Belle and how everybody had manners. And I think what he's doing is he's peeling back those layers to show that it's not all beautiful, that there actually is some rotten and horrible things that the white community was committing atrocities of at this point in time. He's deconstructing Southern literature within Southern literature. Very interesting. So later still, they start hunting Turrell down. And again, hunting. Okay, we're going to come back to this word selection here earlier. This was pointed out by someone else. This isn't my point, but the word selection here is really important. So they hunt Turrell down with these dogs. And that's when Hubert starts to raise this bet of $500 that you can just walk over to that cabin tonight, because where's he going to spend the night? In his lover's cabin, right? Buck's the hunter, right? His honor's on the line. So he takes that bet thinking that he can more quickly obtain Turrell through hunting through the man's way, but at the same time, why? You have kind of a pull where I think he's kind of meeting Sophonsiba, but he's kind of playing that younger, immature game of not wanting to get too close, because if he gets Turrell before dark, he can head back home and not have to spend time with Sophonsiba. Does he succeed? So we get a feist dog, which again, if you haven't watched our bear video yet, or are on your way to, it's a specific breed of dog, a very small hunting dog in a lot of American hunting days, even found back in George Washington's journal. But at the same time, they bring a ribbon from Sophonsiba to Buck. He reels back, holding it like a water moccasin. This part was hysterical, and I think furthers the flirting, and you can draw kind of like the snake bite fall analogy here, but I didn't take it that way. So this feist dog helps them kind of follow Turrell's trail. They're doing some doubling back. Nothing that important here. What's important is when they corner him in the house. When they talk about treeing him up, circling round back, cornering him, these are all hunting terms. And what happens is Buck's supposed to be the good hunter. Turrell bursts out of the cabin, barrels over him, and escapes. Kind of emasculating Buck, showing him he's not the best hunter, while using all hunting terms to kind of bring this piece together. So why is that important? So one, I think if you didn't realize earlier when Turrell was talking about using women to help get some stuff done, you're starting to, one, realize the protagonist is not Buck. And secondly, they go back to the house and head to a room where they think Sophonsiba will not be, where all the lights are out. And who's lying there in wait to catch Uncle Buck. Again, they're going to use hunting words here in terms of treeing up, circling around, lying in the den when Sophonsba catches Uncle Buck. That's why he used these terms and had these two scenes, was to compare and contrast the masculinity, the hunting, and who's the real protagonist. And that's when it starts to peel back even more layers and you realize Sophonsba ain't messing around. She's hunting for a man too. So now we go back to that necktie. Who did he put that necktie on? I think we have a little bit of a, he doesn't really want Sophonsba, but he ain't resisting it too much either. So the next morning they wake up and Hubert's like, man, you gotta marry Sophonsba now. You were creeping up in there. You knew what you were doing. Play a game of poker. Buck loses. And now he's gotta kind of marry Sophonsba or take her back, as well as purchase Tenny and Turrell, the objective that these two wanted all along to be together. So he sends Kaz off to get Uncle Buddy, the gambling guy, to come back and get some help. And they mentioned earlier on that they might need to send Kaz back to get Buddy to help out. Now Uncle Buck's calling for it. So Buddy has another game of poker played where he kind of weighs the dowry against the previous bet. And they call in someone to deal the cards. Who could that possibly be? And basically, Hubert gets 3 of a kind, and Uncle Buddy needs that 4th card. In a deck of 52 cards, there's only 1 card he needs to complete his straight. Statistically, the most unlikely hand to win. Mr. Hubert would be crazy not to go all in and bet at this point in time, right? He looks to see who dealt the cards, and he sees that Turrell dealt the cards and folds because he realizes the game ain't fair. They're probably stacking it so that everybody gets kind of what they want on that side of the field, and Mr. Hubert would be the big loser. So this does a couple of things. It's making light of the situation. It's very dark humor, but don't forget, they are gambling over a person here. Not only just a person, not even just in universe time where slavery was legal of slave property. Their half-brother too with that. They're not viewing them as a human, but at the same time, they're also cheating to get what they want here. This is an incredibly complex scenario that William Faulkner has set up to discuss this concept of was. How did things used to be, and how did we used to view the people in this situation? Now, the next question you might have is, this could be a fun story. This could be setting up themes, but why were Buck and Buddy not just purchasing Tenny for Tommy's Turrell? I think you might have a little bit of lineage commentary here too, where they are preventing the furthering line of what in their culture in the era of slavery was considered. He had a claim to patrimony and they didn't want to allow that. They didn't want to allow the half-white side of the McCaslin line to continue. This isn't said explicitly, but I think that's the commentary that we have here, because we're going to explore a lot more about this half-white McCaslin line throughout this whole book, short stories, connected short stories, whatever you want to call it. This is setting up the core theme of what Faulkner wants to explore. This is what happened. Now watch how the people and generations in the future react to this. Let's also go back to our protagonist line. Who orchestrated everything? Who was the one that worked with Sophonsba to get everybody what they wanted, kind of? This is kind of the McCaslin's telling the, hey, this happened before your time, Ike, who's going to become the central figure of this. This is the War and Peace of, before I get to this war, I need to set up, Tolstoy had to set up here, here's all the pieces that led to it. Here's Faulkner setting up all the pieces of, hey, here's what led to your life, Ike McCaslin. Ike's going to struggle with this question, this half-white line, and what's due to them, what's not to them. Why am I the person to decide that? Why should I be a slave owner or a landowner, for that matter, to make that sort of decision? And all of what chapter is setting that up, to set up the expectations of slavery, where you're kind of viewing the landowners at first, and you start to realize you have the underdog, Turrell and Tenny, pulling the strings and really manipulating this and getting what they want in the end. It's a very interesting and humorous piece to this, but we're not even at the end. We return to the plantation, where once again we have the fox and the dog, whose name we learn is Moses. Now again, go watch our Before You Read, Go Down Moses video, where we're going to talk a little bit more about the Bible and about how Moses was meant to set the slaves free in Egypt. But what does it mean here that Moses got his head stuck in the cage, the fox and the chickens are running free? I think it's not required that you read Exodus, but you need to kind of have some of that background information, where at the same time that this is happening, you see Tenny and Turrell finally get what they want. Buck and Buddy didn't finally get that Sophonsba connection there, or did they? We're going to find out more as we continue to read this book, but you need to kind of compare those themes to really understand what the importance of that chase was and how Faulkner is going to kind of explore and view this idea of slavery. We're going to stop here for just this short story of Was as chapter 1. I do want to do 2 chapters in one, but the problem is that this next chapter, The Fire and the Hearth, and I think are my 2 favorite parts and really deserve a deeper dissection of what do these chase elements mean and the idea of property and a half-brother mean. That's explored in Was. Next, let's see what kind of happens down the lineage line with The Fire and the Hearth. And then after that, I'm hoping to combine chapters 3 and 4 and chapters 6 and 7 to one video to kind of speed things up. But I do think that this text needs a lot of talking about because it covers some very important themes in our cultural history. So with that said, guys, please consider subscribing to check out the next parts of our Go Down Moses dissection. I really am enjoying this book. I'm hoping you guys consider reading it. If not, you can do individual short sections of this if you want to just check out Faulkner. It's a great place to start if you haven't already. So with that said, guys, peace out and happy readings.